Before we delve into ES6 classes, let's try to understand components and composition from a different perspective in this section. We discussed how easy it is to solve a problem by breaking it down to smaller parts or components and solve individual problems. Then finally compose the solutions of smaller problems to solve a bigger problem. We followed the same principle while developing our shows app. We first created some individual smaller components like title, poster, and show info that does the work of displaying title, image, and show information respectively onto the screen. Then we composed all these individual components inside our show component that helped in building our shows application. Okay, to explain composition in React, I would like to give an example that almost every programmer uses. And it is something that is very fundamental concept to all the programming languages. There comes primitive data types and objects. Almost every programming language provides us some primitive data types. For example, in JavaScript, we have primitive types as number, string, boolean, null, undefined, and a new one, symbol, which is recently added in ES6. If I say var num equal to 10, and if I check the type of num, then it's a number. Similarly, if I do var name equal to Sam, and if I check the type of Sam, then it's a string primitive type. The same is true for boolean primitive type. And we use these primitive types to create objects. So let's say I need a way to store information about a person Sam. Then I'm gonna create an object Sam, which is composed of first name, last name, and designation, which are of primitive types string, and age, which is of primitive type number. Similarly, I have another object Dean, which is composed of again primitive types. We call our Sam and Dean as user-defined types, which are composed of primitive types. We can further compose these Sam and Dean objects together to get even bigger user-defined type, which is hunters array. We can also extend it further by composing this hunters array in another object, and we can continue the process. Looking at this trivial example, you can imagine how powerful composition is, right? Composing primitive types to construct objects, and composing these objects, we can create much bigger objects. If you observe carefully, that's the exact same principle React is also adopting. In React, we have these built-in components h1, h2, div, span, image, button, etc. And we compose these built-in components in different ways to create user-defined components. Further, we can compose these user-defined components to create bigger user-defined components. For example, we created a custom component title, which when written in JSX returns an object or React element of type title, and it is composed of h1 primitive element. Also, we created a custom component show info that composes of primitive types paragraph and heading. And finally, we compose these user-defined types title, poster, show info, and primitive type next show button to construct an even bigger component show. So if you look closely, there is not a lot of difference between how we compose user-defined data types using primitive types in the language and how we compose user-defined elements using built-in elements in React. Even when we code in HTML, we try to divide the page into several components like header, footer, forms, section, etc. that are composed of HTML tags. HTML header can in turn be composed of several HTML tags, and so does sections as well as footer. Finally, let's look at one last example before we wrap up our discussion on composition. Components are not very different to functions. Suppose when user clicks on an Udemy course, in response, Udemy does multiple tasks using functions. One function might check if the course link is valid. Other function might check if user is logged in. And one might check if user is authorized to access the contents of that course, etc. So they have divided the task into smaller tasks implemented using functions, and Udemy finally composes all these functions together to provide the access to the course. Similarly, React allows us to divide our user interfaces into smaller functions and compose them together to create a complete application. Essentially, React components are just special functions that accepts props and returns React element object that describes the view. And we compose these React elements or views to create a bigger view and ultimately our desired web application. That's how components and composition are interrelated in React. And that's the underlying principle in building applications using React. Alright.